The DEC's been in Buffalo and Cortland and Brooklyn and Albany asking people how to spend a whopping $4 billion on climate change and the environment. New Yorkers voted last year to borrow the money. Today, the DEC's in White Plains. The Bronx is next. And last Friday, it was Saranac Lake's turn. And a lot of people showed up with their thoughts. We hear them on today's Story of the Day.
Support for Story of the Day is provided by Renew Architecture and Design, designing camps, custom homes, and more throughout NCPR's listening region. Details at renewarchitecture.com.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Tuesday, August 15th. First up, 2 promotions at the Fort Drum Army Base near Watertown are on hold due to a nationwide blockade by a Republican senator from Alabama. Senator Thomas Tuberville has blocked hundreds of military nominations during President Biden's time in office. Tuberville has said he objects to a Pentagon policy that ensures abortion access for members of the military. 2 colonels from Fort Drum have been awaiting promotion since February. According to the Watertown Daily Times, those promotions could result in an extra $4,000 a month, which the men have missed out on. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who previously served as commander of Fort Drum, called the military promotion blockade as, quote, unnecessary and unsafe. SUNY Potsdam is facing a $9 million deficit, and faculty members are concerned about what changes are coming for the college. Catherine Wheeler reports those will likely be announced soon.
SUNY Potsdam has been struggling with a multi-million-dollar deficit for several years. College officials have said in the past the deficit increases are due in part to declining enrollment. There's also been leadership turnover in recent years. The Watertown Daily Times obtained an email from the Faculty Senate chair. That email says faculty should prepare for impacts like potential staffing cuts and restructuring. The email says the deficit grew about $5 million from last year. The college has already cut some degrees, and some instructors' contracts have not been renewed. In a statement, Associate Vice President for Communications, Mindy Thompson, says the administration is aware of the faculty's concerns for the future of the college. She says the college's president, Suzanne Smith, will be announcing plans for the future in the next few weeks. Catherine Wheeler, North Country Public Radio.
A Saranac Lake woman is accused of killing an Indian Lake man over the weekend. State police and the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office responded to Big Brook Road in Indian Lake Saturday night for a report of shots fired. Troopers say they found 32-year-old David Chenier dead at the scene. An autopsy later determined he died of gunshot wounds to the chest and neck. 57-year-old Ann Favreau was charged with second-degree murder in connection with Chenier's death. She was arraigned in Indian Lake Town Court and sent to jail without bail. The investigation into Chenier's death remains ongoing. Police are looking for surveillance footage of the suspect's vehicle and telling people to keep an eye out for suspicious found property. Anyone with information is asked to contact state police at 518-873-2750. More than 120 people showed up in Saranac Lake last week to hear about the Environmental Bond Act. State officials are collecting ideas on how to spend the $4.2 billion that New York voters approved last fall. Emily Russell was at the meeting and has our story.
It's known as the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, and it allows New York to spend billions of dollars on climate change mitigation, land protection, water infrastructure, and more. Last Friday, folks filled the Town Hall Auditorium in Saranac Lake for a listening session on the Bond Act.
Everyone, please take a seat. We'll be getting started momentarily.
For about an hour, folks in the crowd were briefed about the details of the Bond Act. They heard from state officials like the executive director of the Adirondack Park Agency, as well as the DEC Commissioner Basil Sagos.
This is truly a once-in-a-generation opportunity to protect New York, make it more competitive over the long run, economically competitive, because we know that a clean environment leads to a clean economy,
Unlike the last bond act New Yorkers passed in 1996, this one doesn't earmark specific projects. Instead, it sets aside certain pots of money for specific priorities. There's $1.1 billion for environmental restoration and flood risk reduction. There's also $1.5 billion for climate change mitigation efforts. The next step is to figure out which specific projects the state will fund.
It really ends up coming back to you all to help us prioritize projects, right? We need to identify projects all across the state, and we're starting to get some good ideas through our portal.
You can fill out an online survey through that portal about project ideas for the Bond Act. State officials are also accepting in-person input at these listening sessions. Bill Farber was in Saranac Lake on Friday. He's the town supervisor of Morehouse in Hamilton County. Farber said he's eager to see money from the Bond Act funding upgrades to local infrastructure.
Early on, I think when you look at the magnitude of the needs that local government has, starting with water and wastewater, some of the storm recovery issues that could be avoided if we have the ability to invest up front in some of this infrastructure.
The Bond Act sets aside $650 million for water and sewer projects. Farber said he'd also like to see investments in trails, campgrounds, and boat launches.
We have a plethora of land and recreational opportunities across the Adirondacks. A lot of those are desperate for investment, and I think the Bond Act can help with that.
Another main focus of the funding is preservation. Jackie Bowen is the director of conservation for the Adirondack Council. Bowen said the council would like to see funding from the Bond Act to help preserve and protect farms around the park.
Our local food systems are a finite resource, and as we anticipate more people moving up to the Adirondack region, how can we help protect those lands so that we can also feed the Adirondack communities as well?
While it's unclear which projects will get funding right now, the reality is that the Adirondacks is disqualified from more than a third of the $4.2 billion. That's because the Bond Act requires 35 to 40% of the money to fund projects in communities that the state defines as disadvantaged. Those are places that will bear the brunt of climate change and already deal with pollution and the lack of access to open spaces. Most of those communities are in the New York City and Long Island area, though there are a handful of, quote, disadvantaged communities in the North Country, including Messina, Ogdensburg, and Akwesasne. Near the end of Friday's Bond Act listening session, Bowen from the Adirondack Council said she's happy to see that folks from around the Adirondacks are engaged in the process.
Honestly, the most exciting thing was the number of people in this room. People from the community, local governments, other advocacy organizations, right? It shows that there's a lot of excitement about what this Bond Act money can do, and I hope it's also an indicator that the Adirondack region will see some of this money.
State officials say they're accepting input on Bond Act projects through the middle of September. They could start allocating funding for projects by the end of this year. Emily Russell, North Country Public Radio, Saranac Lake.
We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Christopher Watts and Bee Children, all from Canton. I'm David Sommerstein, North Country Public Radio.